We're never going to keep it anyway. That's the part I keep coming back to, not the staircase, not the sound my own ribs made. The thing my mother said first, in that flat boardroom voice she used for closing deals and ending arguments. You're just the carrier, sweetheart. The baby's the inheritance. Sign it over to your sister and go back to your little life. She slid the paper across my grandmother's old maple table like she was dealing cards. 3 acres on a lake in Muskoka, a trust worth $680,000, and a clause my grandmother had written that none of them had counted on, all of it sitting between us while I sat there 7 months pregnant, one hand under my belly, doing the math she didn't think I could do. Before I tell you what I did the night my mother decided a cottage was worth more than her grandchild, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what the weather's doing out your window right now. I want to know how far this story travels. Down here it was the second week of November, the first real freeze, black ice on the 400 and the lake already skinning over. Remember that, the cold matters later. I said no, one word. I didn't even raise my voice. My mother didn't argue. My mother never argued. Arguing was for people who weren't sure they'd win. She stood up so fast the chair barked against the floor, and her face did this thing I'd seen exactly twice before in my life, both times right before someone in our family lost everything. It wasn't anger, not really. It was the look of a woman watching money walk out the door. It belongs to her, she said. Everything. You don't get to ruin this with your accident. And she meant the baby. She put both hands flat on my chest and shoved. I want you to understand something about me. I've been a paramedic for 9 years. I've pulled people out of cars folded into the guardrail on the 401 in February. I've done CPR on a kitchen floor while a 4-year-old watched from the stairs. Panic is a thing I trained out of myself a long time ago, the way you train a flinch out of your hands. So when the floor tilted and the top of the basement stairs opened up behind me like a mouth, my brain didn't scream. It went to work. I tucked my chin. I turned my shoulder. I wrapped both arms around the front of me and made my whole body into a shell, and I let my back and my hip take the stairs instead of my stomach. I counted them on the way down the way you'd count compressions. Shoulder, hip, the edge of the third last step catching me across the ribs with a crack. I felt more than heard. I landed at the bottom on the cold concrete by the laundry, and the breath was just gone, scooped right out of me, and for a second, the only sound in the whole house was the furnace kicking on. I looked up the stairs. My mother was standing at the top with the light behind her. She wasn't coming down. She wasn't reaching for the phone. She was just watching, the way you watch a pot to see if it's going to boil over, and I understood. Lying there on the concrete with my ears ringing, that she was waiting to see whether it had worked. My training got there before the pain did. Airway clear. Breathing, shallow, splinting on the left. Probably a cracked rib, maybe 2. Belly soft, no guarding, no gush. And then the only assessment that mattered. I went still and I waited, palm pressed flat below my navel, and I held my breath until my chest burned, and then, there. A roll. A small, indignant pushback against my hand, like she was annoyed at being jostled. She was alive. I didn't cry. I want to be honest with you because crying is what they expected, and I had already started to figure out even then, even on the floor, that everything they expected from me was a weapon I could turn around. If I cried, I was a victim. And in that house, a victim was just a problem you hadn't finished solving yet. So I got up. I don't remember it as deciding to. I remember my hands on the cold steel of the dryer, hauling, and the fire that lit up my whole left side, and my mother saying, in a voice gone suddenly soft and reasonable, "You tripped. You know you tripped. Don't make this into something." My father had come to the top of the stairs by then. My father, who in 31 years had never once stood between my mother and anything. He didn't come down either. He just looked at me with this expression I'd spent my whole childhood trying to read and finally, that night, understood completely. He wasn't worried about me. He was calculating whether this had become more expensive than it was worth. I walked past both of them and out the front door into the cold, and I got in my car, and I locked the doors before I let myself shake. Here's the first thing I did right. I didn't drive to the hospital 20 minutes away where my mother sat on the foundation board and had her name on a plaque in the lobby. I drove an hour, all the way down to the trauma center in the city where I'd done my paramedic placement, where I knew the triage nurses by their first names and nobody owed my family a single favor. I called my husband from the car with the phone on the dash, and when he picked up, I heard him already pulling his boots on at the sound of my voice, and I told him everything in the flat-clipped way you give a patient handoff, because if I let it be anything other than a report, I was going to drive into the median. He met me at the doors. He didn't say, "Are you sure she pushed you?" Or maybe it was an accident, or any of the things the rest of them would spend the next month saying. He put his hand on the back of my neck and he said, Okay, we document everything. We do this right. And I loved him so much in that fluorescent doorway that I almost forgot to be afraid. They scanned me, 2 cracked ribs, a deep bruise across my back the size of a dinner plate, soft tissue damage to my hip, and a fetal heart rate, thumping away on the monitor like a drum solo, strong and fast and furious. The doctor printed everything. The nurse, I'd worked a shift with her, years back. She photographed the bruising and time-stamped it and put it in the chart, and she put her hand over mine and said, "You want me to call the police from here?" And I said no, not yet, because by then, sitting on that gurney with my husband holding the ultrasound printout, I had already started to see the whole shape of it. You have to understand how my grandmother set things up, because the whole thing turns on it. My grandmother didn't trust my mother. She'd watched my mother spend my childhood building my sister into a kind of trophy. The pretty one, the easy one, the one who got the lessons and the car and the down payment, and watched her treat me like the bill that came with all of it. The accident from a marriage she'd felt trapped into. So when my grandmother passed 2 years ago, her will did something clever and a little cruel. The cottage and the bulk of the money didn't go to her daughter. It went into a trust for the first great-grandchild, the first baby born into the family. And until that baby came along, the whole thing just sat there, locked, with the estate lawyer as trustee and my mother unable to touch a cent of it. My sister couldn't have children. They'd been trying for years. It was the one thing in her gilded life that hadn't gone her way. And then I got pregnant. I was the carrier. That was the word my mother kept using, and now you understand it. My baby was the great-grandchild. My baby was the key that unlocked $680,000 and 3 acres on the lake, and as the baby's mother, I would be the one administering that trust until she came of age. Not my mother, not my sister, me, the daughter who measured her life in 12-hour shifts. The money my mother had been circling like a hawk for 2 years was about to fall into the hands of the one person in the family she couldn't control. So they had 2 ways to fix that. The clean way was to make me sign a family settlement agreement renouncing the baby's entitlement, redirecting the trust to my sister, signing my child out of her own grandmother's gift. That's what the paper on the maple table had been. And the other way, if I wouldn't sign, was to make sure there was no great-grandchild at all. Because if the baby never came, the clause failed, and the whole trust collapsed back into the general estate, which my sister stood to inherit anyway. Get rid of it. It wasn't an insult. It was a plan. That's the thing that settled over me on the gurney like a wet blanket, the thing that turned the fear into something colder and more useful. They hadn't lost their tempers. My mother hadn't snapped. She had stood at the top of those stairs and made a calm financial decision about my daughter's life, and my father had stood beside her and let her, and they had both expected me to come home crying so they could write it off as a fall. I'm not a violent person. I've spent my whole career on the other end of violence, cleaning it up. But lying there, I made my husband a promise, mostly to myself. They were going to confess every piece of this with their own mouths in a room they couldn't lie their way out of, and I was going to be holding the door. My phone had been buzzing against my thigh the whole time. When I finally looked, there were 23 missed calls and a wall of texts, and almost all of them were from my father. "Your mother is beside herself. You scared her half to death. She says you slipped. You've always been clumsy. Come home and let's sort this out as a family before it gets out of hand. Don't do anything you'll regret. Think of your sister. Not one word about whether I was hurt. Not one word about the baby. He was already laying down the track. She slipped. She's clumsy. Beside herself, building the version of the night they'd tell the neighbors, the version they'd tell a judge, the version they'd tell a judge, the version they'd tell my child someday. He offered in the same breath to pay my hospital bills, as if there were bills, as if all hype didn't cover the ER. He was offering to pay me off with the very money they were trying to steal, and he didn't even understand the country he lived in well enough to make the bribe make sense. My thumb hovered over the block button. It would have been so easy. Drive home, change the locks, never speak to any of them again. But I knew my mother, and I knew that silence wouldn't end it. Silence would just give her time. Time to get her own lawyer, to file something, to be the first one to a courthouse with a story about her unstable daughter who'd had a fall and a breakdown. If I disappeared, she'd build a paper trail with me in the center of it, and someday I'd be defending my fitness to raise my own kid against a woman who'd been lying professionally her whole life. I couldn't run. I had to end it. I thought about the calls I run. The people who scream and fight and swing, you sedate them, you restrain them, the situation controls you. And then the quiet ones, the ones who go still and conserve everything, who give you nothing to work against. I decided to go quiet. There's a name for it, a thing people use against narcissists. You make yourself boring. Gray rock. You don't argue, you don't explain, you don't bleed in front of them. You give them nothing to feed on, and you let them get comfortable, and comfortable people get careless. I didn't send a picture of my ribs. I didn't call my father a liar. I sat in the passenger seat with my husband driving us home through the black ice, and I typed one message, and I made it sound like exactly the broken girl they were expecting. I'm scared. I don't want to fight. I'll talk about the agreement. 3 dots instantly. They were watching. They were hungry. I let them sit for a second, and then I added the hook. But not at the house. I can't go back there. Can we meet at the lawyer's office tomorrow, at the estate office? Just bring the papers. The reply came in seconds. Good girl. We knew you'd see sense. 10 a.m. Don't be late. Good girl. My husband read it over my shoulder and made a sound in his throat. I just looked at it glowing on the screen. They thought the stairs had scared the fight out of me. They thought they were walking into a surrender. They had no idea I was bringing them somewhere they couldn't take back a single word, in a country whose own laws they'd never bothered to learn. Because here's what my mother didn't know and what most people don't know until they need it. In Canada, you're allowed to record a conversation you're part of. One party. You don't need anyone else's permission. I could walk into that office with my phone running in my coat pocket and capture every word, and it would be mine to keep. And the office I'd picked wasn't random. It was the estate lawyers, the trustee, the man whose signature controlled the whole locked trust, and the man I was about to learn, whose name my father had already done something very stupid with. I spent that night not sleeping. My husband wanted to come. I told him no. I needed them to see me alone and small and outnumbered. I needed them so sure of themselves that they forgot to be careful. He didn't like it, but he understood. And at 6 a.m, he drove me down and parked 2 blocks away and sat in the cold with the coffee getting cold in the cup holder, ready to walk in the second I texted him. That was the deal. He was never not part of it. I called the lawyer's office first thing. I told the man, I'll call him the trustee because that's what mattered about him. I told him I needed 20 minutes before my family arrived and that he was going to want to hear what I had to say. To his credit, he heard the flatness in my voice and he cleared the room. He was old school, this man. 3-piece suit and a Muskoka town where most lawyers wear fleece. Silver hair, reading glasses, the warmth of a frozen lake. He'd been my grandmother's lawyer for 30 years and he did not suffer foolishness. I sat across from him in his office with the window full of gray morning sky and I told him everything. The clause. The agreement they wanted me to sign. The stairs. And then I watched his face when I told him the part I'd only put together at 3 a.m, going back through every document my grandmother's estate had generated. 3 weeks ago, I said, an advance was drawn against the trust. $120,000. I saw it on the accounting you mailed me. The trust isn't supposed to release anything until the great-grandchild is born and the guardian is confirmed. So either you authorize that advance, sir, or somebody put your name on something you never signed. I have never seen a man go that still. He didn't reach for the file. He didn't need to. He already knew, the way you know a thing the instant it's said out loud, that he had not authorized any advance, and that meant someone had forged a trustee's signature on an estate document, and that is not a family squabble. That is a criminal offense. Uttering a forged document, fraud over $5,000, the kind of thing that ends with handcuffs. What do you want? He said quietly. Not what do you want me to do. Just, what do you want? I want you to leave that door open a crack, I said, nodding at the door between his office and the conference room. And I want you to have someone in the next room ready to make a call. They're going to come in here certain they've won. People like my mother, they can't help themselves when they think they've won. They'll say all of it. I just need it heard by someone the law calls a witness. He looked at me for a long moment over his glasses, and then something in his face thawed about half a degree, which from him was practically weeping. Your grandmother, he said, was the smartest person I ever did business with. I see where it went. He picked up his phone. I'll have the police on standby in reception, and the door stays open. At 9:58, they walked in. My mother led, of course. Camel coat that cost more than my car, hair lacquered into a helmet, looking around the conference room like she was deciding whether to buy it. My father came behind, gray and sweating, clutching a leather folio against his chest like a man hugging a life jacket, and my sister last, sunglasses on indoors, mouth set in that bored pout, like collecting her unborn niece's inheritance was just one more errand before lunch. Nobody asked how I was. Nobody looked at the way I was holding my side. My mother glanced at it once with irritation, like the bruise was a tacky thing I'd worn on purpose to spoil the mood. Let's get this done, she said, dropping her purse on the table. We've got the cottage closing at 1. I sat at the far end and made a show of lowering myself into the chair, wincing, keeping my eyes down, my shoulders curled in. I let myself look exactly as small and beaten as they wanted. And in my coat pocket, against my chest, my phone was running. You brought the papers? I said, and I let my voice shake. It wasn't hard. The fear was real. I'd just decided what to do with it. My mother smiled. It was the smile of a trap closing. Right here, sweetheart. Sign on the line and we can all go back to being a family. She slid it across. I picked up the pen and let the tip hover. And then I asked the question I'd come there to ask. Why now? I said. The baby's not even born. The trust can't release for months either way. Why does this have to happen today before the cottage closing? My father flinched like I'd thrown a punch. He wiped his lip with a handkerchief that had seen better days. It's complicated. Just sign it. I can't, I whispered. Not until I understand. Is it the cottage closing? You're not just transferring the cottage, are you? You're selling it. Today. You need clear title today. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, and his hand came down on the table hard enough that my sister jumped. My mother didn't even blink. She'd taken her phone out under the table and her thumbs were moving, fast, her eyes flicking around the room, and I clocked it the way I'd clock a patient's hands going to a hidden wound. Who's she texting? Everyone's here. And then it came to me. Her sister. My aunt. The one who did the dirty work my mother kept her own hands clean of. My mother wasn't just here for a signature, she'd set a tripwire. If this didn't go her way, somebody on the outside was waiting for a signal. I filed that away and I leaned on my father, soft, like I was begging. Just tell me, please, what did you do? And he broke. They always think they're the strong ones, the fathers like mine, right up until the floor opens. I borrowed against it, he said, the words tumbling out. The cottage, the trust, I took in advance. 120,000. There were debts. Private money. Not the bank you don't understand. These aren't people who send you a letter when you're late. I thought I could put it back before the year-end accounting. but the closing fell through twice and the interest. He was pacing now, talking to the window, his reflection ghosting against the gray sky. I needed the trustee to release in advance and he wouldn't. The baby wasn't born, so I signed it. I put his name on the authorization. I just needed it to clear until I could sell the cottage and make it whole. If I don't close today and put that money back before the accounting, I'm not just broke, I'm finished. There it was, forgery, fraud, out of his own mouth, in his own voice, with the trustee whose name he'd forged sitting 10 feet away behind a door that was open exactly 1 inch. I turned to my mother. She'd put the phone down. She wasn't rattled by his confession. She looked annoyed by it, the way you'd look at a dog that had knocked something over. So that's it, I said. You need to sell my grandmother's cottage today to put back money he stole, and you need my baby out of the trust so nobody ever audits it. And when I said no, you pushed me down a flight of stairs. My mother leaned forward. Her perfume reached me across the table, heavy and floral, the exact smell of every bad night of my childhood, and she dropped her voice into something smooth and almost kind. Let's be honest about your situation, she said. You're a paramedic on a shift schedule. You and your husband rent. You have nothing. We have lawyers. We have money. We have lawyers. We have money. We have time. If you don't sign that paper, here is what happens. The day that baby is born, I make a call to the Children's Aid Society. I tell them their mother is unstable, that she had a violent episode and a fall, that she's not fit. I'll have 3 witnesses who will swear to it. She tipped her head at my father and sister. We will tie you up in court until you can't afford diapers. We'll make sure that child grows up somewhere stable, somewhere it belongs. You'll be lucky to get supervised visits. Now sign the paper and none of that has to happen. My blood went cold and I let it show because the fear sold the next part. For 1 second, I really did see it. A stranger in a CAS office, my mother's voice oozing concern. My daughter handed across a table. I let my hand tremble on the pen. Sign it, my mother said, and then, leaning right into me, soft, certain, the cruelest thing she had. Or maybe next time you'll fall down the stairs and not get back up. Extortion. A threat. A confession of intent laid over the assault she'd already committed, witnessed and recorded, on Canadian soil where one of us being in the room was all the permission the law required. I had everything. I set the pen down, and I let the gray rock fall away. I stopped trembling. I straightened my back, slow, ribs screaming, and when I lifted my head, my eyes were perfectly dry, and I watched the certainty drain out of my mother's face like water out of a cracked glass. I'm not going to sign anything, I said. My voice didn't shake at all anymore, but I think the trustee heard enough. I pointed past her shoulder at the door. It swung open. The trustee stepped through, grim as a January morning, and he was not alone. Behind him came 2 OPP officers who'd been standing in his reception area the whole time, since 9:45, waiting on his nod. The air went out of the room. My father made a sound like an animal in a trap, a high, thin whine, and folded into his chair. He understood faster than the rest. He understood that the men with the baseball bats couldn't reach him in a cell and that a cell might be the only safe place left for him. My mother froze with her hand half lifted. She'd half risen out of her seat at me, forgetting entirely where she was, forgetting the witness, forgetting the country. She looked at the officers, at the trustee, at me, and her face wasn't afraid yet. It was confused. People like her don't process consequences, they process obstacles. She tried to pivot, voice climbing into the bright, reasonable register she used for neighbors. This is a family disagreement, she said, smoothing her coat. My daughter is very emotional right now. She's pregnant. She's not well. No, the trustee said. He didn't look at her. He looked at the officers. This is forgery of a trust document, fraud, and an attempt to extort a signature with a threat of violence made in front of me against a beneficiary I am bound to protect. I'm the trustee whose name is on that forged authorization. He set a single sheet of paper on the table, face up, my father's forged version of his own signature staring up at all of us. I'll be giving a statement. The handcuffs going onto my father were the loudest thing I have ever heard. He didn't fight, he just wept, mumbling about interest rates and grace periods, about how he'd almost had it covered. My mother turned on me, screaming now, the mask gone, calling me a liar, calling me unstable, saying I'd faked the bruise, saying I'd planned all of this, and the last part was true. And I let her see that it was true, and it stopped her cold for half a second. And then the real blow landed, and it didn't come from me. My sister, who had sat through all of it inspecting her manicure, suddenly shoved her chair back from our parents and put both hands up, eyes flicking from the officers to me, fast, calculating. "I didn't do anything," she said. "I didn't touch her. She pushed her. She pushed her." She pointed at our mother. "Down the stairs, at the house, last night. I saw it. I'm a witness. I'll testify." For the first time in either of our lives, our mother wasn't the most powerful person in the room, and my sister had already done the arithmetic and decided which side of it she wanted to be on. My mother turned and looked at her, at the daughter she'd spent her whole life carving into something perfect, the asset, the favorite, and watched her trade her in for immunity without so much as a flinch. And that was the thing that finally broke her. Not the cuffs, not the police. The face of her golden child throwing her overboard. "You're an accessory," one of the officers told my sister, reaching for her wrists. "You can say all of that down at the detachment." They walked them out one at a time. My father, crying. My sister, protesting that she was a victim too. My mother last, and when they brought her past me she'd gone quiet, hollowed out, and she looked at me with no rage left in her at all. Just nothing. Just the empty look of someone whose entire arithmetic had stopped working. The unsigned agreement sat in the middle of the table where I'd left it. The trustee told me to go home. My husband was already through the front doors. I texted him one word, "now," the moment the officers came in, and he crossed that reception area and folded me into him so carefully, mindful of my ribs, and I stood there and shook and didn't have to be the strong one for 30 whole seconds. We drove home through the cold. We peeled off my coat and found the phone still running in the pocket, the whole thing captured, every word. We ordered Thai from the place on the corner and tried to remember how to breathe. I called the midwife and told her I needed to come in just to hear the heartbeat again, and she stayed an extra hour for me, and we sat in that quiet room and listened to my daughter's heart thundering away, unbothered, while my husband held my hand and neither of us said anything. And then, at 7:15 that evening, the lights came. Red and blue, washing through our living room window, and a knock at the door that was 3 officers and a cast worker, and the words, "We received a report that you intend to harm yourself and your unborn child." I knew it before they finished the sentence. My aunt. My mother's tripwire. The text under the table. "If it goes sideways, make the call." Even from a holding cell, my mother had reached out one last time and tried to take my child with the only weapon she had left. But I wasn't on the floor anymore. I stepped out onto the porch in the cold with my hands loose at my sides and my voice as level as I've ever kept it on the worst call of my career. I showed them my phone, no messages threatening anyone, just my own outgoing texts, my own timeline. I gave them the trustee's card and the name of the OPP officers who'd made 3 arrests at his office that very morning. I told them, calmly, that the woman who'd made this report was the sister of a woman who'd been arrested for assaulting me 8 hours ago and that I could prove every word of it, and would they please call the detachment before they came any further into my house. The thought-ass worker, she'd seen 1,000 of these, you could tell, watched my face the whole time I talked, and what she was watching for, I knew, was whether I'd panic. I didn't. The sergeant stepped aside and made the call, and I stood there in the porch light in the November cold with my husband's hand on my back, and 90 seconds later, everything changed. The sergeant came back with his hat literally in his hand. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "We're obligated to follow up on any report. But this is going in her file, not yours. I'd suggest you talk to your lawyer about a complaint." The lights went off. The cast worker left me her card and told me, quietly, that I had nothing to worry about, that she'd note the report as malicious. And then they were gone, and the street was dark and silent, and the lake somewhere north of us was freezing over in the dark, and I went back inside and finally let myself cry, with my husband's arms around me and our daughter turning over inside me like she knew it was finished. The rest came out over the months that followed. My father pleaded guilty, fraud, uttering a forged document, and the private debts he'd been so terrified of turned out to matter a great deal less than the criminal record, which followed him out of the marriage and into a one-bedroom apartment across town. My mother was charged with assault and with public mischief for the false report, and the recording I'd made in that conference room, legal and clean and complete, made her lawyer's job very short. My sister kept her freedom by handing over everything she'd seen and lost every dollar she'd been promised in the bargain. The cottage closing collapsed, the estate was frozen, and the trustee did exactly what my grandmother had built him to do. He locked it all down and held it for the one person it had ever truly been meant for. My daughter was born at the end of January, 8 pounds 2 ounces, screaming her head off, the most furious and beautiful thing I've ever seen. We named her after my grandmother. She is the great-grandchild. The cottage on the lake is hers, held in trust until she's old enough to skip stones off its dock, and the money is hers, and there is not a single person left in my family with the standing to touch a cent of it. I changed my number. I changed the locks. I have a folder and a fireproof box with every photograph and every police report and one audio file I will never have to play again. My mother has written me letters from places I don't open mail from. I burn them in the wood stove without reading them, and I have stopped feeling anything about it at all. Last weekend I drove my daughter up north for the first time, bundled in a snowsuit too big for her, and I stood on the dock of her cottage with her against my chest while the lake steamed in the cold morning, and I told her the only thing about any of it she will ever need to know, that she was wanted. That from the second she was a flutter under my hand on a basement floor, she was wanted and protected, and never for one instant was she anybody's inheritance. Peace was the most expensive thing I have ever owned. I paid for it with 2 cracked ribs and the last shred of hope I had for the people who raised me, and I would pay it again tomorrow without blinking. If you've ever had to cut off your own family to keep your child safe, type the word free down in the comments and tell me where you're reading this from. I want to know how many of us there are. I think about that basement floor more than I expect to, not the fall itself. The second after it, when I lay on the cold concrete with my hand on my belly, waiting for a kick, and chose not to scream. That choice is the whole story, really. My mother had spent 31 years counting on me to react the way frightened people react. And the one time it mattered most, I didn't give her what she was counting on. Everything that happened in that lawyer's office grew straight out of that one quiet second. What I've come to understand is that none of it was luck. My mother pushed me, and a chain of consequences started that she was far too arrogant to see coming. She forged a signature, and forgery leaves a paper trail. My father borrowed from people who don't forgive, and desperation makes a man confess to anyone who'll listen. My sister was raised to believe she'd always be protected, and so the instant she wasn't, she turned. Every single one of them was undone by the exact thing they'd been rewarded for their whole lives. Causes have effects. You can outrun them for a while, the way my father outran his debts, but they always close the distance in the end. If there's anything I'd want my daughter to take from this someday, it's this. Doing the right thing matters even when it costs you, maybe especially then. I refused to sign away her birthright when signing would have made my whole life easier, and that refusal is the only reason she has a home on that lake today. But being good isn't enough on its own. I didn't beat my mother by being kinder than her. I beat her by being smarter, by knowing the law of my own country when she never bothered to, by setting a quiet trap instead of a loud fight. Goodness without a clear head just gets trampled, and neither of those would have mattered without the part nobody sees. The long, sleepless night, the hour my husband sat in a freezing car waiting for a text, the willingness to walk back into a room with the people who just tried to kill my child because running would have left her unprotected. That kind of steadiness, the refusal to fold when folding is the easy thing, is what carried the other two across the finish line. I'm not a hard person. I spent my whole career trying to keep strangers alive on their worst days. But I learned that protecting the people you love sometimes asks you to be clear-eyed and unbreakable at the same moment your heart is shattering. My daughter will grow up knowing she was never anyone's inheritance, never a key to a locked door, never a thing to be signed away. She was wanted, and the woman who made sure of that wasn't braver than anyone. She just decided on a cold concrete floor that some things are worth standing back up for.